Hello there everyone and welcome back to Russia in Context. Today we're going to be examining one of last week's largest news stories, Russia's departure from the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We'll take a look at what the initiative was, why Russia left, and perhaps most importantly, what comes next. So to start, let's go back to February 23rd, 2022. Already on the evening before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Moscow positioned its navy forces in the Black Sea to block off the coast of the Odessa Oblast, which is home to some of Ukraine's largest ports and the remains of its navy. Most of Ukraine's aging fleet was appropriated by Russia when it seized Crimea in 2014, though two-thirds of the vessels were later returned. A few months after the blockade began, Ukraine, with the aid of Turkey and the United Nations, got Russia to agree to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which allowed Ukraine to ship grain from its ports. Grain exports are one of the last sources of real income for Ukraine, but more importantly, they are vital to aiding international food security, as Ukraine is a top grain exporter. Kiev in the West insisted that the grain deal was imperative to make sure that countries in Africa and Southeast Asia, which rely on grain imports, would not be faced with food insecurity or even famine. Russia stated that the reason they were preventing ships from going in and out of Ukraine was supposedly to prevent the movement of weapons into the country. Now, I just want to point out that Ukraine has been receiving plenty of weaponry over the last year, none of it by sea, so the Russian rationale is not really valid any longer. The grain deal was implemented on the 22nd of July, 2022, and was valid for 120 days with the option of prolonging it for the same amount of time, which was done multiple times. Russia did suspend its participation on October 29, 2022, after Ukraine attacked Russian warships in the Sevastopol harbor, but quickly resumed participation less than a week later, when it became clear that Turkey and Ukraine were going to continue the grain initiative without them. Fast forward to summer 2023. The Kremlin has spent months complaining about how unfair the grain deal has been for them, how they didn't get anything out of the deal, how their demands weren't being met, with the fervor and pitch increasing substantially in the last few weeks. However, I realized I didn't know all the details of their demands, nor was I familiar with what exactly was stated by the United Nations in the documentation for the Black Sea Grain Initiative. I did some reading, and so that we're all on the same page, I thought I'd lay out all the pertinent information for you. Let's start with Russia's demands for resuming the deal, which were quite extensive, a total of 6 points. 1. They wanted sanctions removed from grain and fertilizer shipments, which, based on numbers I found, is equivalent to about $30 billion, basically the same amount that Ukraine earns from its grain exports alone. It should be noted that there are no direct sanctions on grain and fertilizer exports with regards to Russia, just on banks and companies connected to the trade, which in turn has made it more difficult to arrange shipments and payments. That brings us to demand 2. Banks and financial institutions connected to these exports, specifically Rossельхозbank, need to have restrictions against them removed and be reconnected to the SWIFT payment system. Point 3. Moscow wants renewed imports of agricultural machinery and parts, as well as equipment connected to the production of fertilizer. I can't be sure about this, but I believe a number of these items are considered dual usage, meaning that they can be used then in the production of military equipment or weaponry, making this likely a no-go from the start. Point 4. Make sure agricultural exports can be insured and logistics taken care of. Point 5. No hindering of deliveries involving fertilizer or the raw materials needed to produce it, as well as turning the Taliattia-Odessa ammonia pipeline back on. And finally, point 6. Unfreeze Russian assets connected to agriculture. In return for all of this, Russia will allow Ukraine to use its own ports to ship its own grain. It seems like an even trade, right? But what did the Black Sea Grain Initiative actually entail? It provided for inspection teams in Turkey with representatives from Turkey, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine. It stated that all activities in Ukrainian territorial waters would be under the authority and responsibility of Ukraine. No one was to attack merchant or civilian vessels, and demining, if needed, could be provided by a third country to be agreed upon by all parties. All merchant vessels would be registered in the Joint Cooperation Center in Istanbul so that they could be monitored. However, monitoring was done remotely, as no military ships, aircraft, or drones were allowed to approach the maritime humanitarian corridor. Most importantly, at least from the Russian point of view, was that all vessels were to be inspected when they went into and out of the Black Sea. That's it. The United Nations released another document, further clarifying what the Joint Cooperation Center in Istanbul was responsible for, namely, enabling the safe transportation by merchant ships of commercial foodstuffs and fertilizer from 3 key Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea: Odessa, Chernomorsk, Yuzhny. The new center will monitor the movement of commercial vessels to ensure compliance with the initiative, focus on export of bulk commercial grain and related food commodities only, and report on shipments facilitated through the initiative. The new center will not facilitate the export of food from countries other than Ukraine, and facilitate exports of containers and non-food items not included under the provisions outlined in the initiative. That's all that was agreed upon. Nothing about lessening Western sanctions against Russia or helping them transport ammonia. Nothing like that. Russia simply decided that they deserved those things for allowing legal maritime trade in the Black Sea. Aside from not getting what they felt was owed them, the other Russian explanation for pulling out of the grain deal was the fact that Ukrainian grain wasn't going to the poorest of countries, especially those in Africa. However, the UN reports that 57% of the exports went to developing countries, all of which were in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. I don't know, maybe Russia's definition of poor means something different from that of the UN, but if so, they probably should have done a better job clarifying that. Even still, all of the remaining 43% of their Ukrainian grain that went to developed countries didn't necessarily find its way to the tables of fat Europeans and Americans. Oftentimes, grain is sold to such countries, and then it is milled and processed into things like flour, before then being exported once again, including to poorer countries, which depend on imports of such goods. Therefore, it's not unreasonable to assume that at least 60% of Ukrainian grain wound up in countries that truly needed it. So, the Kremlin's claim that the grain deal wasn't doing what it was intended to do seems, at best, willfully misinformed and, at worst, intentionally deceptive. You make your own call on that one. Also, I hate to be that guy, but nowhere in the grain initiative did it say that Ukraine was obligated to give away all of its harvest to those in need. Farmers have to earn a living, and they do that by selling the, sometimes literal, fruits of their labor. Sure, plenty of grain went to Turkey and Europe, but horror of horrors, they had signed contracts for it in advance. By shipping the grain to them, Ukraine was simply making sure those contracts were honored. The last thing I want to comment on with regards to this specific point is that upon pulling out of the grain initiative, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated that taking Ukrainian grain off the market would not negatively affect those countries which relied on it. I don't really understand how this is possible. Ukraine ships a substantial percentage of certain types of key grains, especially corn and wheat. And if they disappear from the global market, that doesn't mean more will just magically be grown elsewhere. Instead, it means that the price for such grains will increase, which in turn means that richer countries will likely buy just as much as they did before, leaving poor countries with less to go around. Now, if I'm incorrect about this and someone can explain to me how I'm wrong, I would love to hear. Before we get into what happens next, we also need to talk about Turkey's role in this, both geographically and politically. Because Ankara controls the Bosphorus Strait and the Dardanelles, they are in a role to regulate which ships go into and out of the Black Sea. The 1936 Montreux Convention, signed by Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, and the Soviet Union, as well as the United Kingdom, France, and Greece, gave Turkey the right to close the straits to warships of belligerent countries in times of war, or if Turkey was itself at war or felt threatened by aggression. Turkey can likewise prevent merchant ships from traveling in and out if they belong to countries at war with Turkey. International merchant ships traveling to and from Ukrainian ports, well, they don't fall under any of these restrictions. Moreover, in order to reach said ports, they do not traverse Russian territorial waters. In effect, Russia is illegally blockading Ukrainian ports, as policing of another country's territorial waters goes against the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. For this reason, Ukraine has been asking the International Maritime Organization to step in and do something about the military blockade. Perhaps because nothing has been done about it, Ukraine is putting forth the idea of NATO escorts to ensure that ships are allowed into Ukrainian ports. However, before you go screaming anything about escalation, NATO ships have a right to be in the Black Sea, as Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey are all members. Additionally, escorts are not a military threat, more a security measure, and regardless, the Montreux Convention only allows Turkey to prohibit the transit of warships from belligerent states. In theory, a number of small warships from Italy or France, or God forbid, even the United States, have the right to enter the Black Sea and patrol about in NATO member waters. Otherwise, Turkey would need to invoke Article 21 of the Convention, which allows them to close the straits for all ships. But in order to do so, they'd have to prove that they feel threatened by imminent danger, which is not the case. Even if Turkey did do this, it's likely that it would be brought up before the United Nations and probably ultimately blocked. Now, politically, Turkey is straddling the fence. On the one hand, it's a NATO member and a country which wants closer integration with the European Union, but on the other hand, there's Putin and Erdogan. As strongman-style leaders, they have this sort of long-standing relationship, and they have supported each other in times of domestic turmoil in the past. For this reason, Erdogan is unlikely to do anything too brash that would potentially damage the pair's standing. However, the initiative brought benefits both economically and politically for Erdogan, so he will likely continue petitioning Putin for a deal renewal, maybe even attempt to persuade him to lessen his demands. However, Putin is ramping up for another shadowboxing election cycle and will not want to appear weak in the face of international pressure, so whether or not Ankara will have any success in negotiations remains to be seen. Since leaving the grain initiative, Moscow has stated that they will target any ships going to or coming from a Ukrainian port. Ukraine responded by threatening to target any ships bound for Russian ports. While many view both threats as just that, Kiev's ability to back up its statement is severely limited. Still, it may be enough to cause insurers to react, which would likely be painful to Moscow. So what happens if the Black Sea Grain Initiative is totally dead? Well, Ukraine did not assume that the initiative would last forever, realizing that the Kremlin, with its love of sowing havoc, could just do that by simply pulling out. For this reason, Kiev devised an alternative to their seaports. Ships that are small enough can now sail up the Danube, which is the border between Romania and Ukraine near the Black Sea, and take shipments of grain from the river port of Reni. Every month, nearly 2 million tons of grain are exported from there. That said, high-capacity ships can't traverse the shallow riverbed, and Reni is not designed to handle large-scale operations. The good news is that the Romanian port of Constanta has stated that they can handle some of Ukraine's grain exports until mid-August. Now, on the 24th of July, Russia attacked Reni with missiles that struck only a few hundred meters from Romania, NATO territory, likely to further damage Ukraine's ability to export grain and scare away ships, although the Russian Ministry of Defense will probably state that there was a valid military target there. The attack was not about military targets, as the Black Sea Grain Initiative only applied to ships that were bound for Black Sea ports, meaning that the ships which have been using Reni for months now, have traversed the waters in this area unhindered, until it became clear that this was a remaining viable option for Ukraine to ignore Russia's departure from the initiative. Putin is set to meet with African leaders on the 27th and 28th of July during the Russia-Africa Economic Summit in St. Petersburg, which should be interesting, as he'll need to explain why he pulled out of a grain deal that was designed and agreed upon to benefit African countries. Putin has preemptively justified his actions on the ground that they were not providing the humanitarian aid that was intended, although according to the United Nations, this is a false claim, and that Russia is ready to replace Ukrainian grain with Russian grain, even for free. A quick aside, the offer of free grain to African countries has some in Russia questioning why Putin doesn't show such generosity to the citizens of the country he rules. Russia has already exported wheat to Mali, one of their closest African allies, at a discounted price of $220 per ton versus $292 per ton in Europe. However, there are plenty of African countries that are solidly miffed with the situation. Egypt, the world's largest importer of wheat, is extremely displeased, and Kenya has described the Kremlin's actions as, quote, a stab on the back at global food security. It's still unclear how this whole situation will shake out. For now, global food prices have remained steady, likely because many believe there will be an agreement reached sometime in the next month or so. In the chance that doesn't happen, Ukraine and its allies are currently searching for alternatives to Ukrainian seaports, or a way to ensure that they can use them safely. Latvia recently just floated the idea of using its ports to export Ukrainian grain, although there are issues with Ukrainian trains and European trains being different gauges, so there are logistical problems here as well. Who knows? Needless to say, it's a complicated situation, but if you've made it this far, I hope that you'll come away with a thorough understanding of where all parties stand, as well as what brought us to this point. Now, if you believe I've misinterpreted something or missed crucial information, be sure to share your thoughts and any relevant links in the comments below. If you just liked the video or thought it was interesting, you can let me know that in the comments as well. Or just hit the like button. And be sure to subscribe if you haven't yet. Videos like this take some time to put together. A lot of research goes into it, so I'd likewise appreciate it if you shared this with others who might enjoy it. That all said, this has been Russia in Context. Thanks for watching.